Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, welcome to Teaching, Listening and Speaking online course with Miss Dayu. How are you doing at home? I hope all of you are doing great. Okay, so before we start and move further to the material, I'd like to remind you that this video will be divided into two parts. In this very first part, we are specifically going to talk about teaching listening, and the other one, the second part, will focus on teaching speaking. So let's start talk about teaching listening. But before that, I would like to remind you about one more thing. Yes, teaching listening speaking should be different from teaching reading and writing. That's the other subjects in this semester too, right? Teaching reading and writing. Okay, so while teaching listening and speaking focus on spoken discourse, teaching reading and writing focus more on the written discourse, and both discourses are very different. The spoken discourse is usually more spontaneous and delivered in a more linear order. The written discourse is less spontaneous and delivered in a more hierarchical order, right? So they're actually very different. So teaching listening and speaking and teaching reading and writing should be different, right? So focus on teaching listening now, okay? Okay, so before you start to implement activities, methods, and strategies in your classroom to teach listening for your EFL students, you have to be aware of your goal in teaching listening to them. Are you going to focus on their comprehension, or are you going to focus on their second language acquisition, or both, right? So teaching listening actually is divided into two goals, two purposes. The first one is teaching listening for comprehension, and the other one is teaching listening for acquisition. Teaching listening for comprehension means doing listening activity that focus on understanding what is being said by the speaker. So it's actually you listen to comprehend. You listen to understand some certain information. Okay, so listening for comprehension. In listening for comprehension, there are two kinds of processing. The bottom up, so you start from the bottom, and then the top down. So you start from the general into specific. Okay, so let's start from the bottom up. What is bottom up processing? Why do we have to understand bottom up processing before we teach? So bottom up processing is actually listening activities or a style of teaching listening, a strategies in teaching listening that focus more on the grammatical and lexical aspects of the language. So you basically will focus on the sound, the pronunciation, the meaning of some particular words, and then the syntax of the sentence, and you don't really give particular attention on the main ideas and some other broader ideas about what is being spoken by the speaker. So that's bottom-up processing. In bottom-up processing, the listener usually relies more on the lexical and grammatical knowledge. There are several activities that can be developed if we want to focus more on doing bottom-up processing in teaching listening for comprehension. The first one is dictation. So the lecturer or the teacher will dictate and the students will usually listen or take notes. And then the second one is close listening. So you give them some recordings in which they have to listen very carefully to understand some instruction that you give to them. For example, to identify the adjectives, to identify the sound of some particular words, and etc. And then the next is the use of multiple choice questions after a text. If you're familiar with TOEFL tests, well, yes, that is implementing a bottom-up processing in listening. So you basically have text being spoken, yeah, that you listen from a recording, and then you will be given some multiple choice questions that is related to the text that you have just listened. There are also other activities that can be developed in bottom-up processing, such as recognizing the time reference of an utterance, and then distinguishing between positive and negative statements, and then identifying keywords that occurred in a spoken text, and many other things. So basically, in bottom-up processing, you focus on the more detailed things like the sound, the grammar, the meaning of the words, okay? And it will be completely different from the other kind of processing, which is top-down processing. So let's continue to talk about top-down processing. So in top-down processing, we focus more on the main ideas of the text. So it's still about comprehending text, but this time we focus on the whole idea, the main idea. Okay, so in understanding the main idea, we cannot only focus on the sound of the words, the single meaning of the words, or the syntax of the sentence. We have also to involve background knowledge of the listener. So background knowledge is actually the most basic thing that the listener should have before doing this top-down processing. By having background knowledge, the listener will be able to make connection, to understand the context, to understand the broader scope of what is being said by the speaker, and eventually understanding the main idea of the text. In teaching listening for comprehension with top-down processing, we can implement these several activities, such as for example, you can ask your students, after listening to a recording, to a text, yeah, you can ask them to infer the setting for a text, and then you can also ask them to infer or to make inferences of the cause and effects in the text. And then you can also ask them to make an inference of the role of the participants and their goals in the text. So basically, the instruction that you gave will stimulate or trigger the students to use their background knowledge to try to make connection, to try to create intertextuality. So in the end, they will be able to understand the broad scope of the text from a wider perspective. Okay, so that is top-down processing. So top-down processing and bottom-up processing might be different from one and another, but they actually have the same goal. They help the listener to understand or to comprehend what is being said by the speaker. So it's actually an effort to comprehend the text. It's the same. It's still in the context of listening for comprehension. Since top-down processing and bottom-up processing has the same goal to create comprehension for the listener, when you teach listening for your EFL learners, EFL students, you don't really have to separate those two kinds of processing. You can actually combine them too. So how to actually combine top-down and also bottom-up processing in a sequence of teaching listening activity? Well, you have to divide your teaching into three parts. The first one is the pre-listening, and then while listening, the core activity, and then the next one or the last one is the post-listening. What happened during the pre-listening? In the pre-listening, you can ask your students to make prediction about what they're going to listen, and they can also try to review the key vocabulary that will be used in the text. And then for the core activity, you can focus on their comprehension through exercises that require selective listening, guest listening, and sequencing. Okay, now on the last part, or the post-listening, you can involve a response to comprehension, and it may require students to give opinion about a topic. So post-listening, even though it's the last part, it's actually not the least important part of the whole listening activity. So pre, the core activity, and the post-listening. Okay, if all of them combine together, it will create a harmonious teaching for the students that can help them to improve their listening for comprehension. Alright, enough for listening for comprehension. Now let's move on to the other kind of listening, which is listening for acquisition. Listening for acquisition is a little bit different from listening for comprehension. In listening for acquisition, we do not only focus on the comprehension. So our main goal is not only to understand certain information in the text. Okay, we listen for a second language acquisition process. So actually, the listening is a part of the second language acquisition process. Okay, so we listen from the movies while also learning the language expression used by the actor and the actress. We listen to news while also learning about the vocabularies that can be implemented in our daily conversation. We can listen to YouTube videos, and then we can also learn about their culture, understanding the different culture between ours and also theirs, and we will use them to practice our language in real life. That is listening for acquisition. So I have two kinds of activities that can be implemented to improve listening for acquisition. The first one is noticing activities, and the second one is restructuring activities. What is noticing and restructuring? Okay, noticing activities involve returning to the listening text that served as the basis for comprehension activities and using them as the basis for language awareness. For example, students can listen again to a recording in order to identify differences between what they hear and the printed version of the text. They can also listen again to the recording in order to complete a closed version of a text. They can also listen again to recording in order to complete sentence systems taken from the text. Okay? And they can also check off entries from a list of expressions that occurred in the text. So, noticing activities, basically, you listen to one particular text or recording in which you notice some, for example, language expression, different kind of habits. You notice about different way in expressing something, and then you use those activities to develop your own second language learning practice. The other activities in listening for acquisition is restructuring activities. So restructuring activities is actually an oral or written task that involve productive use of selected item from the listening text. Okay, so while in the noticing activities, you simply just notice what is different, what can be implemented, what kind of different expression that can you use for your daily conversation, for example. In restructuring, you actually start to practice it. So after you notice in the noticing activities, you start to use what you have noticed and implement it in your conversation, such as discussing some issues that you get, that you listen from the recording or the text. And you can also do a role play to to discuss and to implement the language expressions that you learned from the recording or the text. That is restructuring activities. So even though listening for comprehension and listening for acquisition has slightly different goal, but it doesn't mean that we cannot combine them into one sequencing activities in our classroom. So basically, we can actually combine them into one great sequencing activity in our classroom. The first one is, for example, you can give your students a recording, yeah, a text, for example, like this. This is the script, and then you can divide the activity into two phases. In the first phase, you can implement listening for comprehension. During the first phase, you can use the materials as discussed in the preceding section to, for example, to answer multiple choices or bottom up, and to identify the main ideas, to understand some certain information that is being said in the text. That is in phase one. By implementing the listening for comprehension. And then on phase two, we can implement listening as acquisition, in which the listening texts that were used previously can now be used as the basis for speaking activities. Okay, so for example, making use of noticing activities and restructuring activities. For example, you can notice several language features or several expressions in the text and implement it into a role play, or you can notice one particular issue that is being delivered in the text and discuss further with your peers in the class, so that the class can be more lively. The listening activity, the listening material do not stop only for comprehension purpose, but also it can be used further to improve the language mastery and proficiency. Okay, so everyone, that's all for today for the very first part of teaching, listening, and speaking video. We will still see each other again on the second part, in which I will specifically discuss with all of you about teaching speaking. Okay? Have a great day for all of you at home. Stay safe and stay healthy. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bye-bye.